Good evening. My name is Ruben Dupertwee. I teach in the religion department here at Trinity and am, along with Chad Spiegel and Brian Laporte, one of the co-organizers of this year's Lennox seminar on reinventing the Bible. On behalf of the organizing team, we'd like to thank a number of people, including the marketing and communications department for their help in getting the word out. We'd also like to thank our colleagues in the religion department for all of their support of the series and of the course. We're very grateful to the theater technicians who have helped us throughout, Jake Purcell and tonight Sarah Thurman, who are all part of Tim Francis's team here. And we're grateful to Paul Feuerbacher, who has been recording the lectures for us. And finally, in the list of thanks, we want to thank and express our gratitude to the Martha, David, and Bagby Lennox Foundation for providing the funding that makes this series possible. Yes, sir. In Reinventing the Bible, in the seminar, the Reinventing the Bible and the lectures, we're taking a close look at how communities throughout history have created and recreated their Bibles, and how the constantly shifting nature of authoritative texts, collections, and interpretations forces us to reconsider how we use generalizing terms like Bible, Scripture, and canon. Before introducing today's speaker, I'd like to alert you to the next lecture in the series, the fourth and final lecture, which will take place on Wednesday, April 13 at 6 in the Fiesta Room. It's the only one of the series that is going to be in a different venue. In the Fiesta Room of the Coates University Center. Our speaker will be Mark Chansey from SMU, and he'll be speaking on the topic, the constitutional conundrum of teaching Bible history in American public schools. Turning now to matters at hand, it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Valarie Ziegler. She received a master's degree, Master's of Divinity from Yale University and a PhD from Emory before teaching at Rhodes College for 10 years and then moving to DePauw University, where she's been since 1995. Dr. Ziegler is a historian of religion in the U.S., an area within which she has a broad range of interests. She has written and given talks on North American peace movements, on women and fundamentalism, and on Elvis. I think of the thread that runs through her work as an interest in what happens to ideas as they are used in and shaped by different cultural contexts and communities. She has written on peace movements in the antebellum South, the subject of her 1992 book. She has co-edited a book called Eve and Adam, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Readings on Genesis and Gender, published in 1999. Her book, Diva, Julia, The Public Romance and Private Agony of Julia Ward Howe, returns to abolitionist arguments and won the 2002 Trinity Prize. In her most recent book, Enticed by Eden, How American Culture Uses, Confuses, and Sometimes Abuses Adam and Eve, co-written with Linda Shearing, looks at the many ways in which the Bible and ideas about it play in some contemporary evangelical circles. We'll be hearing about her work from that book this evening. I'm excited to have Dr. Ziegler here for personal reasons as well. We met about 10 years ago when I was teaching at Centre College, which is her alma mater. She encouraged me in a conversation to write up those loose ideas I had about comic book Bibles that I'd been toying with them for a while, and I did so and have continued to work on that ever since, and I'll always be grateful to Dr. Ziegler for her encouragement. Without further ado, let's get to Submission, Sex, and Sin Raptors, the evangelical Adam as alpha male in American popular culture.
Do you know who they are? Anybody? You just think about it. Okay. This is the first time I've been to Trinity, but it's not the first time that I've had contact with people from Trinity. For years, I was the faculty advisor to the DePaul Tiger Pep Band, and we had the distinct privilege of being part of the Final Four Pep Band in 2003 when the Trinity Tigers won the national championship. And it was our pleasure and privilege to play Eye of the Tiger about 20,000 times. So I feel like I know you a little. Nobody? Thank you. Yeah, it's the Duggar clan from 19 Kids and Counting, and they are at the Creation Museum in Kentucky. But before we get to the Creation Museum, if we think about the Creation Museum or about People magazine's obsession with the ever-expanding Duggar clan, Adam and Eve are ubiquitous in American popular culture. Don't believe me? Just do a Google search. The first two hits link to sex toys at the Adam and Eve store. And after that, you'll hit games, films, discrete sex toys, skits, art, Bible studies, diets, dating services, and hot luxury sex toys. So what's up with that? Well, Adam and Eve are significant because they represent a time of origins, when human beings were perfectly formed and when the relationship of man to woman and of humanity to the natural world was ideally delineated. People care about Adam and Eve because they're models of who we really are and how we ought to live. There's a lot at stake in our depictions of the original humans. For example, suppose I ask you, well, what do you think about gay marriage? Someone will say, because someone always does, something like this. Well, I believe that God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and... There you go. Or even if we're talking about food, like, hey, yeah, I'm really into that paleo diet, we're again referencing human origins. And many vegetarians, vegans, fruitarians, and raw foodists justify their diets by pointing to the non-cooking, non-meat-eating first couple, Adam and Eve. So in short, Adam and Eve represent for us what is natural, and whoever controls popular understandings of life in Eden has considerable cultural capital. No one has had more at stake in defining Adam and Eve than conservative evangelical Christians. Eager to recreate American society in the image of Eden, conservative evangelicals have given us eHarmony, princess purity balls, erotic wife spanking, militant fecundity, and a steady stream of illustrated Bibles depicting dinosaurs romping with Adam and Eve. Not to mention also a succession of spectacular sex scandals. When evangelical Christians interpret Genesis 1-3, they invariably argue that a literal reading of the text reveals that God created woman to be subordinate to man. Fidelity to the Bible, they argue, means practicing this gender hierarchy as central to Christianity. This exaltation of male power and privilege not only gives license in the evangelical world to abusive behaviors, think Josh Duggar, but also impacts important levels of social discourse in the larger culture. The question I want to ask tonight is, just how committed to literal readings of Genesis 1-3 are conservative evangelicals really? When we look at creationist children's Bibles, we will see that emphasizing the centrality of Adam's role leads to deliberate distortions of the Genesis narrative. Though the Christians who advocate this interpretation of Genesis claim that they are reading the text literally, we will see that that is far from true. We will see that it is more important to depict Adam as an alpha male than it is to render the story accurately. I guess I just have to ask, has anybody ever looked at a children's Bible? Yeah, some of you must have had children's Bibles growing up. They have pictures and all that kind of stuff. Okay. Has anybody ever looked at a creationist children's Bible? Don't think so? Well, okay. You know, it's not too early to start getting those Christmas presents. So think about that. Yeah, if you want to see dinosaurs running around in Eden, that's the place to go. And they're really interesting. But before we even get to that, I want to just review some of the talking points in Genesis 3. It's a complex text. It can plausibly be read to advocate either gender equality or gender hierarchy. So let's just walk through it quickly. In Genesis 1, humanity is the culmination of creation, the very last thing that God creates. God fashions male and female in the divine image simultaneously and gives both female and male dominion over the earth. It's hard to see much gender hierarchy there. In Genesis 2, on the other hand, God's very first act is to create a human. After God creates the animals, God gives the human authority to name them. Woman is God's last act of creation, and she is formed out of the first human as a partner. It's possible to conclude from this story that the man is superior to the women, although you might argue alternatively that the man is incomplete without the woman, and that, as in Genesis 1, God saved the best creation for last. In any case, after first the woman and then the man disobey God in Genesis 3 by eating the forbidden fruit, the created order changes forever. The serpent is cursed to crawl on its belly. The woman will labor mightily to bear children. And because he listened to his wife, the man will labor mightily to harvest food from the earth. The woman is told as well that your desire shall be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Clearly, things have taken a different turn from what God originally intended. When Christians read Genesis 1-3, they typically argue that the disorder and sin that mark the world after the original disobedience are reversed and redeemed in the salvation offered by Jesus Christ. Even making that argument, however, leaves a lot of questions. For example, is it significant that the woman sinned first? Is man's rule over woman an unfortunate result of the fall, or is it God's will? And even if it is God's will for the post-fall world, should male domination continue after redemption in Christ? In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul argues that once people are baptized in Christ, there is no longer male and female, for all of you are one. That sounds fairly egalitarian. On the other hand, there are New Testament passages that reference Genesis 1-3 to subordinate woman to man, such as 1 Timothy 2. Let a woman learn in silence, with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. That doesn't sound egalitarian at all. That was a really fast run through the whole history of creation, fall, and redemption. And I know we could debate many of those ideas all night. And really, that's my point. These texts may plausibly be cited to argue for gender equality or for gender hierarchy. Both kinds of passages are present. They just are. What marks the conservative evangelicals that we're going to discuss tonight is their absolute insistence that the subordination of woman to man is the central characteristic of life in the garden. Christian men, as a result, are to lead and subjugate Christian women. Christian women are to submit to Christian men. Indeed, The gender hierarchy of man as initiator and woman as responder is the essence of Christianity. It's not that male dominance and female submission are part of Christianity, rather they constitute Christianity. This theology of gender is known as biblical manhood and biblical womanhood, and it was given classic expression in the Danvers Statement of 1987. Popular evangelical writers like Joshua Harris and Elizabeth Elliot have argued that in Genesis 1-3, God was the creator of romance, who laid out complementary gender roles that allow for ecstatic sex within marriage. Preparing evangelical children for this future means emphasizing celibacy prior to marriage, while training boys to exercise leadership and teaching girls to wait patiently for males to take the initiative. The Christian courtship movement of the early 2000s embraced this theology wholeheartedly. Boys were expected to be warriors, while girls were urged to think of themselves as princesses, patiently awaiting the Prince Charming God would send them. The reward, all of them were told, was that God would in time present each of them with their soulmate spouse, just as God gave Eve to Adam in Eden. And when at last the two embark on their long-awaited honeymoon, according to Josh Harris, their lovemaking becomes a jubilant two-person worship service. Well, that's a good marriage, or at least a good honeymoon. The difficult thing about that is very few real-life marriages are that ecstatic. And the evangelical courtship movement wasn't particularly successful in producing them. Since then, many evangelicals have resorted to online Christian dating services, although the ideology of biblical womanhood, which forbids women from initiating relationships with men, is really problematic for that venue. I mean, the women, if you're not supposed to initiate a relationship, you can't be sending emails, and anyone will tell you when you join a dating service that if you don't send out emails, you're not going to get dates. The reality is, whether through courtship or dating, evangelicals are marrying later and later in life, just like the rest of Americans are. In response to what evangelicals leaders therefore see as a crisis, President Albert Mohler of Louisville Seminary, Southern Seminary in Louisville, has denounced evangelical men for postponing marriage to enjoy what he calls an extended adolescence. Mohler identified this trend as what he called the sin that besets this generation, and insisted that marriage was for Christians not a choice, not a lifestyle, but an obligation. Evangelical dating sites who have followed his argument have demonized the whole idea of soulmates and have dismissed sexual attraction as a temporary emotional disposition bound to fade. In the beginning, they argue, Adam loved Eve for her godliness, not her looks. And contemporary men should do the same thing. After all, they argue, a face is just wrapping paper, and sometimes, and I quote, the tackiest wrapping paper covers the best gift, end quote. You can guess for yourself just how successful that ugliness is a virtue campaign has been. Then there are evangelicals who take a sterner line. Christians in the biblical patriarchy movement, well represented in San Antonio by the Jeffrey Bodkin family, Doug Phillips, and the recently shuttered Vision Forum Empire, argue that God created man to be sovereign over woman in the family, in the state, and in the church. That the use of birth control violates God's command in Genesis 1 to be fruitful and multiply. That fathers are sovereign over the training of their children, and that God created woman to be confined to the domestic realm as the helper to her husband, the bearer of children, and a keeper at home. Girls are homeschooled, they forego higher education and outside employment, and they renounce personal autonomy to serve their fathers until marriage, at which point they will submit to their husbands and practice militant fecundity. At this point, if you do know the Duggars and 19 Kids and Counting, we've reached them. What I've just described really fits the Duggars to a T. In these Christian families, men's sex drives are thought to be explosive, and wives are expected to provide sex on demand to their husbands. If you keep up with the Duggar saga, you know that Joshua, the oldest son, is in a lot of trouble because over the past year it's come to light that first he sexually molested his sister, some of his sisters, as a teenager, and more recently was wildly unfaithful to his wife. If you know that, you probably also know that Michelle Duggar, Josh's mother, has suggested that Josh was probably pushed into infidelity by his wife, Anna, who is constantly pregnant and therefore not always excited about having sex. So Anna's failure to respond excitedly to Josh's overtures is possibly to blame for Josh choosing to join an online group that practices marital infidelity. Michelle likes to say that, anybody can make her husband lunch, but only a wife can satisfy the sexual needs he experiences throughout the day. If submitting to sex on demand sounds a tad coercive, there are conservative evangelicals who take it up a notch, paralleling biblical manhood and womanhood to rape and war. David and Tim Bailey of the Clear Note churches describe wooing as warfare, a kind of velvet-gloved violence in which the man separates a bride from her family and proceeds to conquer her. Idaho pastor Douglas Wilson has argued that the biblical concepts of true authority and submission rightfully render marital sex akin to rape. However we try, he says, and I'm quoting, the sexual act cannot be made into an egalitarian pleasuring party. A man penetrates, conquers, colonizes, plants. A woman receives, surrenders, accepts. And there is at least one form of conservative evangelical sexuality that employs overt violence, those who practice Christian domestic discipline. In a fallen world, these Christians argue, where women seek to control rather than to submit to their husbands, men must use corporal punishment to enforce their authority. CDD women understand the connection to Genesis 1-3. As one wife reported, after questioning her husband's plans for outdoor work on the farm, quote again, "He told me to go to the house and sit. I am to be his helpmate, not the foreman. Part of being submissive is to be silent when he gives me directions to do something. He doesn't need my opinion or another way to do it. He needs my obedience. Why can't I keep my mouth closed? And why do I feel the need to usurp his authority? Well, I know why. It comes from the beginning, the Garden of Eden. After he wore me out over his knee, I was sorted back again. There's just so much peace and harmony when he's in the lead and I don't have to make the decisions or even second guess the way he wants it done. I love the way I can be fit to be tied one moment and as peaceful as a lamb the next. A lamb with a red bottom, but happy and content." All right, that's sort of a whirlwind tour of biblical manhood and womanhood. And I think if we've learned anything from it, it's that conservative evangelicals are really big into gender hierarchy, and that they find that hierarchy ordained divinely in Genesis 1-3. I want to move next then to a curious phenomenon that I've discovered in illustrated children's Bibles produced by Master Books. Master Books is the self-proclaimed world's largest publisher of created-based material, as well as the only publishing house in the world that publishes creation-based material exclusively. Master Book publications are closely associated with Ken Ham, the originator of the Creation Museum in Kentucky. That's him in the middle. The guy to his left in the hat, we'll be talking about him as well tonight. And Ken, in addition to founding the Creation Museum in Kentucky, has anyone been? No. Are there billboards here advertising it? I haven't gotten this far? Okay. He's founded this thing called the Answers in Genesis Foundation, charged, according to its motto, with defending the literal truth of the Bible from its very first word. So, the Duggars, some of these people are extra, but the Duggar family, without Josh and Anna there, are at the Creation Museum in September 2014. And I'll be talking again about the guy in the back in the middle, Ken Ham, and then the guy to his left, Buddy Davis, the guy in the hat. And the curious phenomenon that I want to examine isn't why there are all these children's Bibles abounding with illustrations of dinosaurs romping in Eden. If you get into this material, you get used to that right away. I mean, there's a million books that depict that. What is unusual in the renditions of Eden that we're going to look at is it's not the cuddly sin raptors, but it's the ways in which the first man, not the first woman, is singled out for blame for the original disobedience. The man, I'm saying, not the woman, is singled out for blame. Even more unexpected are the visual representations in which the first man appears to have taken the first bite of the forbidden fruit. The one thing that nobody argues about in Genesis 3 is that the woman was first to eat. So why do these illustrations in children's Bibles suggest otherwise? That's our question. Now, you will not be surprised to hear that I will not be arguing that young earth creationists have embraced feminism. As we've seen, no group on earth is more dedicated to the subordination of women to men as part of God's original design in creation than conservative evangelical Christians. Indeed, what I will argue is that it's because writers like Ken Ham and Buddy Davis insist that God created men to rule over women, that man must be the star of the earthly drama of creation, fall, and redemption. Even if that entails man playing both the villain and the hero. More important than fidelity to the biblical text is the need for the first Adam to sin spectacularly, so that Jesus, the second Adam, can redeem magnificently. One more preliminary remark. In her classic historical study of the Bible for children, Ruth Bodegeimer contends that the closer we come to the 19th and 20th centuries, the greater Eve's share of guilt in children's Bibles. As I've argued elsewhere, however, contemporary conservative evangelical retellings of the creation accounts to children don't necessarily mesh with the theological points that these Christians emphasize for adults. The theology of biblical manhood and womanhood typically stresses that the woman was first in disobedience, that God punished the woman by appointing the man to rule over her, and that as a result, women may not teach or hold authority over men. Perhaps not surprisingly, there are, that point really scares people, especially kids, when they read it. And it's a point that theologically conservative children's Bibles often gloss over. At first, I was really surprised by that. In particular, one point that is often omitted is Genesis 3:16 to the woman, "Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." That text gets cited ad infinitum to adult women, but it really rarely shows up in these children's Bibles. And I found that weird until I realized that for these writers, Genesis 3:16 is extraneous. If men are designated as God's regents on earth and women are created to submit to them, Genesis 3 really doesn't add any new information, and so you don't need to upset children by quoting it. Okay. In the books we'll be looking at today, we'll see that the younger the audience, the more likely the children's Bible is to exonerate Eve. This is my creation Bible, words by Ken Ham, music by Buddy Davis, aimed at children as young as 2. This book condenses the entire Bible to the creation, the fall, Noah's flood, the Tower of Babel, and Jesus' birth, crucifixion, and resurrection. This page covers the original disobedience. All right, so take a look at it. The picture shows Eve holding the fruit with a bite taken out of it, but it isn't clear if she's giving the fruit to Adam or if he has handed it to her. Take a look. What do you think? It could go either way. It isn't clear. But if you look at the text under the picture clearly blames Adam for sampling the fruit. But Adam did eat, now death there would be. All right, so what I'm saying is the picture is ambiguous. We know that the woman ate first. That's how it goes in Genesis 3, but it isn't clear that that's what's happening here. Does that make sense? Everybody got that? Okay. The next page shows Adam dropping the fruit. And again, the fruit has only one bite taken out of it, while Eve covers her face. Readers are never told that the woman ate the fruit at all, much less that, at least in the Bible, she was the first to eat. Remember, you're a kid, this is your children's Bible, this is everything you've been told. And so as far as you know, from the text and the pictures, the woman didn't eat at all. And again here, the text blames only Adam. Adam ate from that tree, and that is called sin. This is the reason for the mess we're all in. All right, the facing page shows the antidote for that mess. The baby Jesus who will undo the disaster Adam has perpetrated. A later illustration of the cross shows a boy covering his eyes and crying. The girl next to him remembers the original sin. It's pictured in a thought bubble above her, and realizes that the new Adam on the cross has reversed the sin of the original Adam by the tree. 4,000 years after it all began, the Son of God became a man. He died on the cross for you and for me to pay for our sin. Remember that tree. All right. The book then concludes, admonishing readers to remember that Jesus is the only door to heaven. Buddy Davis's When Dragons' Hearts Were Good is aimed at a slightly older crowd, kids aged 4 through 8. Most of the book depicts Adam and Eve frolicking with dinosaurs. There, they're having a good time. No, actually, that's them talking to God, and that's God and the moon waving goodbye. Yeah, so they're talking to God there. When they're not talking to God, they're hanging out with the dinosaurs. Good, all right, got that. And a textual refrain repeatedly notes that these were the good times. That was before Adam sinned. The earth was perfect way back then. Davis warns readers that in time, both Adam and Eve will disobey God's rules by eating the forbidden fruit. He also explains that God's son Jesus will die to pay for their sins and ours, but when the book depicts the primal disobedience, we are once more thrown into a world of ambiguity. Who's handing the fruit to whom? Yeah, it's not clear. What is clear is the identity of the fruit itself. Does anybody know what that is? What? That's exactly right. It's a hand grenade. It's intended to be a hand grenade. No, you got it right. Yeah, it's a hand grenade. You know, it's bad stuff. It's forbidden fruit. Okay. So, just as in my creation Bible, the text accompanying this illustration, which again, if it were in Genesis 3, would clearly depict the woman handing the fruit to the man. Here it's ambiguous who's handing the fruit to whom, but the text that accompanies it blames not the woman, but the man. That was before Adam sinned. The earth was perfect way back then. And again, we know all about Genesis 3, so we know the woman ate first, but young readers who read the story only through my creation Bible, or When Dragons' Hearts Were Good, won't have a clue. And so, we have to ask ourselves why an organization committed to defending the literal truth of the Bible would do this. My creation Bible, after all, promises on its cover to teach kids to trust the Bible from the very first verse. And yet, my creation Bible and When Dragons' Hearts Were Good introduce visual ambiguities into the Genesis text that Genesis 3 itself simply does not support. There's no question who ate first in Genesis 3. The next two books, both written by Ken Ham, that I want to look at are first, Dinosaurs of Eden. That's a good one. That might be my favorite, actually. And The True Account of Adam and Eve. These books are aimed at readers aged 12 and up, and if anything, they have even more at stake in depicting the biblical narrative accurately. Both books stress that the Bible is, quote, the only 100% accurate history book in the world, end quote. And they insist that, quote, studying God's Word is the only way we will know the truth about the history of the universe and mankind, end quote. Telling the biblical story correctly, which for these authors is synonymous with with telling the actual history that happened, telling the biblical story correctly is absolutely critical for young earth creationists because biblical truth is all that stands between them and Darwin. And while both of these books aimed at older children introduce ambiguities into the Genesis 3 story, they also lay out a conservative evangelical theology of gender complementarianism that accounts for the anomalies. I mean, of course, Ken Ham knows that in Genesis 3, the woman was first to eat the forbidden fruit. He focuses on Adam's guilt, not because Eve is innocent, but because in Ham's mind and his theology, she is irrelevant. Adam is the head of the race, and only his actions are consequential. All right. Can you make everybody out there? The kids in the middle are time explorers, and they've gone back to the Garden of Eden, and you can probably figure out who's Adam and who's Eve. Okay. Here, Ham tells readers that in Genesis 2, 16 through 17, God commanded the man not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and God gave Adam a choice to obey or disobey. Ham quotes Genesis 3:6 to tell what happened next. The woman ate and gave some of the fruit to her husband, and he ate. And you can actually see that in the picture here. Eve has picked the fruit grenade, taken a bite, and is passing another grenade to Adam. Pictorially, the woman is the culprit, but the words of the text don't match the picture. The words of the text focus on the man. Adam, our first ancestor, disobeyed God. This is the origin of what the Bible calls sin. Now, what did God say would happen if Adam disobeyed, sinned? God said he would surely die. Readers are then given Romans 5:12 as a Bible memory verse. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for all have sinned. The true account of Adam and Eve likewise notes that Eve was first to eat the fruit, and that she also gave some to Adam. Citing 1 Timothy 2:14, Ham explains, Adam made the choice to eat, and with that decision, the future of all creation would change. Adam had been given the instruction of God not to take the fruit of the tree, and Adam was the head of his marriage as determined by God. This is why Adam is blamed for sin, not Eve. Adam's in trouble because he's in charge, and things have not gone well. He hasn't exercised his leadership appropriately. So again, even though Eve is the first to eat, Adam is the person who's blamed. Both books explain that Adam's poor choice brought about death not only for people, but also for animals. And sadly, the disobedience in Eden is the beginning of the end for the dinosaurs. It's also the literal end for the animal that God sacrifices to make clothing to cover Adam and Eve. Ham argues that these deaths prefigure the death of the second Adam, Jesus. God was showing Adam and Eve, Ham says, that the animal represented a very special person who one day would come and pay the penalty for sin. An animal couldn't take away our sin, since we're not connected to the animals as evolutionists teach. We're made in God's image, very different from the animals. Because a man brought sin into the world, a perfect man was needed to pay the penalty for sin, which is death. Ham's point is that young readers should learn to identify with Adam's sin, since they, like him, also rebel against God. The true account of Adam and Eve exhorts readers to understand that salvation in Jesus means that God sees our sins covered by what Jesus did on the cross. This was the picture that God gave Adam and Eve when he clothed them in animal skins. This is the gospel message, the message we are to preach to the whole world. The illustration accompanying that text is reminiscent of the crucifixion scene we saw in My Creation Bible. We see a penitent boy on a swing set, a thought bubble over him depicting Eve watching as Adam, the representative human, commits the only original sin that matters, while Jesus stands behind as a covering. The woman on the bench, like Eve, is merely an onlooker to the drama of creation, fall, and redemption. The book ends with New Testament quotations to reinforce the scene. 1 Corinthians 15, for as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive. 1 Corinthians 15:45, and so it is written, the first Adam became a living being, the last Adam became a living spirit. And the always reliable 1 Timothy 2, Adam was formed first, then Eve. Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. The typologies are clear here, and they lead to some interesting results. Back to Dinosaurs of Eden. The intrepid teenage boy and girl use the New Testament as a time machine so that they can go back to Eden. And the pictures, when they go back, have the girl and boy paralleled, basically, to Adam and Eve. We see them in Eden watching Adam and Eve eat fruit grenades. And then we see them studying a dinosaur skull while Adam and Eve observe live dinosaurs. There is one group, however, that is not depicted in pairs, and that would be evolutionists. They are represented by lone men. Here, one studies a fossil to no avail. Another stands before the teenagers as they hold the Bible. The girl is passive in this scene. The boy addresses the scientist and points to the Bible, while the male scientist actively blocks the revelation the boy would impart. The scientist has no female partner. Women don't do that kind of thing, who knows? And the girl's presence in the scene, just like Eve's in the garden, is superfluous. The real action here, as in Eden or on Calvary, is the work of men. The one time a woman is shown in an active role vis-a-vis a male figure is as unexpected as it is telling. In spite of the appeal to 1 Timothy 2 in the true account of Adam and Eve, the page following it shows, this is the page right after the one where we saw the boy on the swing set with the thought bubble. The next page shows a pair of white missionaries spreading the gospel. A white male missionary sitting on a block teaches a black man seated at the same level with a black woman situated below him. Well, that's the kind of gender hierarchy we would expect to see represented. The second scene involves a male Asian seated on a chair while a white female missionary stands above him lecturing. How this scenario can possibly be justified in light of 1 Timothy 2, 11 through 15, let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or have authority over a man. She is to keep silent, is hard to say. The underlying message seems to be that race trumps gender. The daughters of Eve may indeed act and speak decisively when they preach the gospel to men of lesser races. So to conclude, we began by trying to account for the odd renderings of the primal disobedience in children's Bibles, written by Ken Ham and Buddy Davis of the Creation Museum and published by Master Books. All four texts that we looked at placed primary blame on the first man, and several illustrations seem to depict Adam as first to eat the fruit, when any reader of Genesis 3 knows that the woman was the first to transgress. Why, then, this odd visual rendering of the primal disobedience? The emphasis upon the first man's sin is critical to a theology that exalts men as God's regents on earth. Because God is male and created men to rule over women, man must be the star of the earthly drama of creation, fall, and redemption, even though that entails playing both the villain and the hero. It is the first Adam's responsibility that sin has entered the world, Romans 5:12, and salvation requires a reversal of that sin through the sacrifice of Jesus, the last Adam, 1 Corinthians 15:45. The exaltation of a male savior requires a male sinner as a fall guy, and visual representations of Genesis 3:6 can depict Adam as original sinner in ways that textual summaries dare not, given the text's clarity that the woman was first to fall prey to temptation. In short, you can show ambiguities in pictures that you can't say as part of the text, because the text, at least in Genesis, is clear. And so, in contradistinction to Genesis 3:6, Master Books artists illustrate the connection between, let me back up here. Young readers must draw a parallel. The point of these books is that young readers must draw a parallel between the man who threw the human race into sin and the man whose death redeemed humanity from it. So, in contradistinction to Genesis 3:6, Master Books artists illustrate this connection by depicting the original disobedience ambiguously, allowing readers to blame or at least imagine Adam as first to eat the forbidden fruit, even as they are exhorted to believe in the literal truth of the Bible from its very first word. Thank you.
Many thanks to Dr. Ziegler. We now have time, actually. We have a little under 10 minutes, but we do have time for some questions. You can ask your question. We'll try to remember to repeat the question so that you all can hear, and then we'll proceed that way.
Yeah.
So I was curious, I noticed in Genesis 1:27, you chose the translation that has, so God created humankind in his image. And I think that's sometimes translated, so God created man in his image. Maybe not, but I was wondering, the evangelical Christians you referred to, what translations do they typically rely on? Is it New International Version or Revised King James Version or some other type?
The question is, the translation that you guys got in your handout has God creating humanity in God's image in Genesis 1, when other translations would render that God creating man in God's image in Genesis 1. And the translation that I'm using there is the New Revised Standard. The rest of the question was, what translations would conservative evangelicals be likely to use? Yeah, they do like what do they like, Ruben? They like the NIV, and there's another. Yeah, they like the NIV and the ESV. I don't think it's controversial, on the other hand, to translate the Hebrew into humanity or humankind. That's what it intends. And as we know, at least back in the in earlier times, people would argue that man was an inclusive term. It was always ambiguous. It could mean people or it could mean males. And so, back in the day, we learned to distinguish that sometimes man was supposed to be inclusive, but if you saw it on a door, that was the bathroom, and girls should not go in there. Did that get at what you wanted to know? Yeah, I don't think people would scholars wouldn't have a problem with that translation. So I don't think that the NRSV, that's the New Revised Standard Version, is playing fast and loose or trying to make a point there.
Is there an estimate of the number of adherents to this particular theology?
What did we do as our estimate last night? The question is, how many people follow this kind of theology? It's millions. Conservative evangelicals are the dominant voice, I would say, in American Christianity right now, or at least the most prevalent one. Brian, do you have a guess on that?
Well, I think evangelicals make up about 25%, and if you split that in half, just to be conservative, you got about 12% of the population who may be, but there's probably more that lean conservative on.
Right. So Brian's saying perhaps 25% of Americans are evangelical Christians, but within that, there's a big spectrum, and about half of those, so say about 12% of the population would identify as conservative evangelical Christians. Yeah, that's rough. Yeah.
I'm a little confused about what the children are taught, and then as they grow older into adults, are they taught that same theology, or does that switch over to the male being, the female is the one who sinned first? I got confused.
Yeah, okay. The question is, what exactly are children taught, and if they're not, and when does it switch over so that it's clear that the woman is the first to eat, if they're not taught that at first, right? That's the question. Kids are integrated into these gender roles from the moment they're born. And boys know that they're supposed to be leaders and initiate. Girls know that they are supposed to be submissive and obedient. In a family, daughters will be treated very differently from sons. And so that's always clear. No one ever has any doubt about that. But what doesn't tend to happen is, at least in the materials for kids, is these materials don't tend to show the scarier parts of that message. Genesis 3:16 really is scary. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Any conservative evangelical girl will know that the father is the head of the household, and that that gender hierarchy is there. But they won't be confronted with Genesis 3:16 until they're older. Or they may be, but they're not in these kinds of materials. Ken Ham actually published one book which leaves Genesis 3:16 out, but has footnotes in it for teachers and parents to read. And he covers 1 Timothy and Genesis 3:16 in the footnotes for the parents and teachers, but doesn't include it in the pictures and the text for the kids. So it's just, it's stuff for older people to deal with. Is that a fair answer? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was struck by, it seems to me that looking at the original feeling of I guess for me it was more of a feeling of outrage that I've seen in the past for the vilification of a woman for being the one to cause the sin. I'm not seeing that in what you're talking about here. It's more the marginalization of the woman as opposed to, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. The question is that you're used to seeing rhetoric that blames women for introducing sin into the world, that villainizes women, and that what I talked about was different. The rhetoric and the pictures that I showed didn't villainize women, it just marginalized them. Good? Yeah, and that's what caught my eye about this material. I got started in this. I live in a small town, 9,000 people, but we had a Christian bookstore. So I went to the Christian bookstore and I bought all the children's Bibles. And I thought, I live in the heartland, it's the Midwest. I'll read these things, I'll see what they're doing with Genesis 1-3, and then I'll have a sense of what middle America, representative America, what Christian kids are learning about Genesis 1-3. And I was really surprised to find Genesis 3:16 often so absent. And I guess I could also say as well, this theological position argues that woman was created to be subordinate to man. There was never a time when that wasn't true. The fall into sin makes it worse, but women were, it is part of the eternal mind of God that this gender hierarchy is essential to who God is and to what God's creation is. Therefore, you don't have to villainize women as much. Even if they hadn't sinned, they would still be subordinate to men. So you don't need to villainize them for being subordinate. What you want to do, sort of ironically, is encourage them in it so that they can find, as the Danvers statement says, that these gender roles should find an echo in every human heart. And so that's what people are to be socialized in. That's a good question. That's really interesting. Uh-huh.
I have a question. Were these the only children's Bibles in that store, or were traditional children's Bibles in the store also?
Yeah. When you go to a Christian bookstore, you're going to get a lot of conservative Christian stuff. But no, there were regular children's Bibles too. And again, I was just curious to see, you know, I knew what theologians debated, I knew what pastors said, but I just thought it'd be sort of interesting to see how kids get integrated into this worldview. And yeah, well, if I had been 6 years old reading children's Bibles and I hit Genesis 3:16, I wouldn't have been very interested in going further in Christianity. I mean, it's not a great line. And yeah, I think it's really scary. They also, I should say, Genesis 3:16 isn't the only thing that gets omitted. In books for really young children, they probably won't even do Genesis 3 at all. They'll just say, you know, God created people, and Adam and Eve really loved God, and God really loved Adam and Eve. And then the next chapter will probably be Noah, because you skip Cain and Abel too. So the younger the child, the more the story just gets stripped down until it's almost not a story at all. And then the older kids become, the more elements get put back into the story. So it isn't just Genesis 3:16 that's omitted. I mean, the instructions to Adam are really scary too. And the fact that they get kicked out of the garden and they have to work hard and they're really sad. I mean, all of that, you know, is not a happy story, really. And so, yeah, it'll fall out for younger kids.
I think, let's do one last, and this will be how we'll wrap it up.
Okie doke.
My question is, did you ever find any children's Bibles that took the route of making the fact that Eve sinned first a reason that she needs to be subordinated, rather than putting Adam first as a way of emphasizing his dominance?
All right, so the question is, did I find children's Bibles that, because Eve sinned first, blamed her and said she needed to be subordinated, right? I don't think I did, but that may not, yeah, I'm going to say I'm not sure. Yeah, rather than being wrong, I'm not sure. I mean, there are some that, one or two. I found a Missouri Synod one that had 3:16, and a few others. So a few, but not many. Thank you, guys.
Many thanks to Dr. Ziegler, and thank you to all of you for joining us this evening.